Why would Russia risk everything and not lose Ukraine to NATO? Ladies and gentlemen, the relationship between Russia and NATO has worsened in recent years, culminating in the current military conflict in Ukraine. This confrontation stems from conflicts of interest when Russia revives its role as a world power with leaders who have tough views towards the West. It can be said that the conflict between Russia and the West is a ghost of the past, a remnant of the confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union and the West, a remnant of the confrontation between socialism and capitalism. The confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States between socialism and capitalism did not only begin after World War II, but it arose right from the Russian October Revolution of 1917 with the birth of the Soviet-Russian state. Right. At that time, Western countries concentrated their forces and sought every way to suffocate the young Soviet Russia. During World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States, England, and France allied together to fight against fascism. The contradiction between the Soviet Union and these capitalist countries still existed after the war ended. When fascism was destroyed, the contradictions between the Soviet Union and the countries of the United States, England, and France emerged even more. These countries changed from an allied relationship to a confrontational relationship in which the Soviet Union assumed the role of a stronghold of the Soviet Union. Socialism in America undertakes the mission of leading the free world to help people around the world fight against the threat of communism and the expansion of Russia. To implement their containment policy, the United States and Western countries have established military blocs and military bases all over the world, forming a siege and isolating the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. Means: the birth of two major global military blocs, NATO and Java, led by the US and the Soviet Union, both rivaled each other in the arms race, equipping them with the most modern weapons, nuclear weapons, to enhance their power. Strength of our bloc: after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia is no longer a stronghold of communism, but it cannot be denied that Russia today is the embodiment of a strong Soviet Union. Previously, replacing the Soviet Union's role at the United Nations after the Soviet Union disintegrated, the Java military counterweight also dissolved, but NATO not only still exists but is also increasingly expanding to the east, threatening the security of the United Nations. Russia, of course, to protect its core interests, Russia cannot sit back and watch the West do whatever it wants. Therefore, just like Germany was divided before, the current conflict in Ukraine shows how fierce the battle for influence is becoming under Mr. Putin. Russia is the embodiment of a leading power at the heart of Eurasian security, increasingly asserting itself as a pole and the counterbalance to the West. Meanwhile, the revival of an intractable power like Russia is something the US and EU do not want. While the US tries to maintain the unipolar world order led by this country, Russia strongly opposes the unipolar order. This pole and advocates a multipolar world that promotes Russia's role in the international arena. The decisions of the US and the West faced opposition from Russia as well as its veto at the United Nations Security Council, while the US continuously proposed plans to cut the defense budget as well as the presence of the US military in the world. Russia is constantly increasing military spending and real and strategic combat capabilities. Russia's military has made important changes in a direction unfavorable to the West, especially in the use of nuclear weapons as a basic measure to prevent war, its technical equipment as well as its combat skills. Russian army is increasing day by day. Looking from the war in Chelsea in the 90s and the war in Georgia in 2008 to the recent Crimea recovery campaign and the campaign in Ukraine clearly show the increasing capabilities of the Russian army. On the one hand, the US and EU need to cooperate with Russia for their economic development. On the other hand, they always seek to restrain Russia, seriously affecting Russia's security and interests in the world. Therefore, isolating Russia, making it weak and even in crisis, is always the wish of these countries. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov commented that it seemed that Western partners and the United States were pursuing a reflexive response, based on the simple principle of us against them and not really thinking about the long-term impact of the situation. What they are doing. In fact, the US and the West have continuously threatened to attack Russia's allies, such as the Yugoslav Federation of Syria, to pull these countries out of Russia's influence and isolate Russia. When looking at the above strategies of Russia, Western leaders in Ukraine cannot help but worry that their country may become the next victim. Of course, the West's actions are met with opposition and Russia's countermeasures as reactions, corresponding to the dominant Thai movements of the West. That is also the cause of the current conflict in Ukraine. Why? So the growth of a Russia that increasingly wants to assert itself along with the expansion of a NATO and US-EU that wants to maintain the number one position is one of the reasons causing the confrontation between Western Russia. Confrontation between countries is also due to another reason, confrontation between heads of state. This is actually an extension of the above analysis but in many cases plays an important role. For example, Russia, if it were not Mr. Putin but another leader who was softer and more docile, the situation might have been different. Of course, then Russia would have to trade many core interests. However, Russia has not in reality. This is not the case in the current case. Even if not Mr. Putin, no Russian leader can stand a military alliance considered Moscow's enemy approaching Ukraine. There is also no Russian leader willing to stand idly by while the West is plotting to install a government with the purpose of bringing Ukraine to the side of the West while Mr. Putin is a tough leader, especially in the relations with the West. In early 2000, right after taking office as president, in a speech titled Russia at the Turn of the Millennium, Mr. Putin clearly expressed his view that Russia should not be expected to follow the American or European model and that Russia for the past and in the future will also be a great country. Under the eyes of Mr. Putin, he realized the shameful truth if he did not restore Russia to the status of a dignified power. He realized the true face of the West when they use money as bait to forcing Russia to comply with their influence. He soon thought of restoring Russia's mighty status, so even though Russia has many interests with the West, especially with the EU, Mr. Putin is not afraid of confrontation and always prepare yourself mentally for a relationship that is not healthy and the soup is not sweet. That tough relationship has extinguished the West's hopes for a friendly, docile Russia. On the contrary, the West also does not like Mr. Putin. For them, Mr. Putin is like a thorn in their eyes. It is not easy to remove, but they have done it in Pakistan, Iraq, and Libya. After being pushed into a passive position by Mr. Putin on the issue, the US and the West are trying to use economic sanctions to make Russia fall into crisis and self-evolution, but Putin's tit-for-tat moves is also causing the West to struggle with discord. In short, the confrontation between Russia and the West is a consequence of the Soviet-American confrontation combined with the core conflicts between the powers and the tough views of the country's leaders. Among the reasons analyzed above, one basic reason can be summarized as a conflict of interests. Of course, for Russia, the interests do not stop at the economic aspect but are the most important. Is national and cultural pride. That is what motivates President Putin to confront the West despite economic losses. Meanwhile, Ukraine plays a particularly important role for Russia considering its location, which is considered a wall between Russia and European countries as well as having symbolic and historical importance. Ukraine is often compared to the jewel in the Soviet crown. President Putin often comments that Ukraine has close economic, linguistic, and cultural ties with Russia, and describes the Russian people and the Ukrainian people as one people. The Russian leader even wrote an article analyze this topic under the heading of the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. However, under Vladimir Zelensky turned to the West for economic support and geopolitical status, especially after when Russia annexed the Crimea Peninsula in 2014. Ukraine has also repeatedly expressed its desire to join the EU and NATO. Many Western strategists and Russian political observers believe that Russia is not only trying to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, but also wants Kiev out of its orbit. Western influence. NATO membership has special symbolic significance and Russia will not accept the West extending significant military support to Ukraine.